Mask of a Diva, a Stan Kraychik mystery, Book 4, 1994. Author, Grant Michaels. Publisher, St. Martin's Press, New York. Author, Eric Aust. For all the divas, operatic and otherwise. Chapter 18. When we arrived at the performance center, the Abigail police were already there as well. I fairly burst from the intimate confinement of Branco's car. For me, physical proximity to that man would need a lot more rehearsal. Baby steps. Time, but what did any of it matter, since I was already partnered. And Branco, from all earthly indications, was straight, even though his presence always caused that enjoyable, if troubling, tingle. On the way into the opera house, Branco stopped to confer with the local cops. They'd already told the cast and crew what had happened to Marcella Ostinata and that the Boston police had been summoned. Branco nodded approvingly, and then, without another word, he and I entered the auditorium together. A stage rehearsal was in progress with Jonathan Byers in charge. Carolyn Bowitz was at the piano. April Kilkus, Wong Young Cho, and the cover tenor was all seen on stage. No one seemed to notice or care that neither Maestro Toscanelli nor Bruce David were present, nor that Madama Ostinata had been permanently detained. Within seconds of hearing the music, Branco murmured, "Un ballo in mascara," in perfect Italian. I glanced at him and saw half a smile curl up on one side of his mouth. "I'm Italian," he said with a small shrug. "We all like opera," he added as if to excuse any mote of culture in himself. We stood and watched rehearsal for a few minutes from the back of the house. I identified the various personalities for him, both on and off stage, and explained the controversial setting of this production in a New York nightclub. At that, Branco leaned close to me and whispered, "I've seen this opera set in a lot of places, but never in modern-day New York." I replied, "The director wants to make his mark." Branco grunted quietly. April Kilkus seemed remarkably well prepared for her role. She proceeded through the rehearsal confidently, as though she had known all along that she and not Madama Ostinata would be portraying Amelia. Still, Jonathan Byers stopped her abruptly, mid-phrase. "Darling," he exclaimed, "you are a jewel, and your voice is pure velvet, and I love everything you're doing, but do you think you might put a bit more worry in your voice? You have been caught red-handed with your husband's best friend, you know." The break in action was Branco's cue to move down the center aisle toward the front of the house. He stopped at the orchestra pit rail and introduced himself boldly. Then he made his big announcement. "We have a serious problem here, folks. As you probably know, one of your colleagues was found dead this morning. For everyone's protection, I'm putting the performance center under police guard under further notice. Beyond that, you can come and go as usual, except that no one will be allowed to leave town without my permission." There were mutterings of outrage among the cast and crew, but it was Jonathan Byers' voice that cut through the muddle. "Maybe under a police state, we'll get some work done." I thought I saw him smack his lips at the sight of Branco. Branco addressed Byers directly. "There's going to be a lot of questioning and interruptions today. You might want to cancel rehearsal." Then he added, "Maybe out of respect for the dead woman, if nothing else." Byers answered him defiantly. "We don't have time for respect here, Inspector Branco. Marcella Ostinata was a bothersome bitch, and it's a relief to know I won't have to hear that voice again." "Since you're so eager to talk," said Branco, "I'll question you first." "Fine," said Byers, showing an unlikely air of cooperation. He instructed his assistant director to run the scene according to his notes. Then he left the auditorium with Branco. I half expected Byers to join arms with the cop. Rehearsal continued with the assistant director fumbling hopelessly with his first assignment. Carolyn Bowitz rescued him and ran the show from the piano. She seemed optimistic and fully in control of the situation. Once again, she accompanied April Kilkus, With that special sensitivity, I'd heard the night of Daphne's reception, and I heard an extra vigor in her playing whenever the tenor or the baritone sang. Perhaps it was the maestro's absence, or perhaps it was the news of Madame Ostinata's demise. But Carolyn Bowitz had acquired a new freedom in her music making. There wasn't much I could do but listen and observe while rehearsal was in progress, so I went downstairs to see if Daniel Carafolio was in the wig room. It was a work day after all, even if the prima donna's throat had been cut. I found Daniel down there all night. He was sitting up on a huge square of cardboard and contemplating a wreath of artificial leaves. Probably something he'd found in the prop department. He was shaking a can of black spray paint when he saw me. "This is a dark hour in the history of opera," he said. "Marcella's death concludes an era of greatness." He began spraying the wreath with glossy black paint. I asked, "Is there anything you want me to do here?" Daniel continued spraying the wreath until it was evenly coated. Then he turned his tear-streaked face to me and said, "Just go home. We should all go home. But you especially. You've been a mistake from the beginning." "Your diva's death is not my fault," I said. "But the migraine headaches certainly are." He turned the wreath over and began spraying the back side of it. "None of that matters now," he said. "It's all over. The production will be canceled. You might as well go and apply for unemployment. I'll sign anything they want." "I don't run away from problems," I said, which was one version of the truth. "I'll work here until I'm let go." "Suit yourself," he said. "But there'll be nothing for you to do." He finished spray painting the wreath. Then he aimed a hairdryer on it. When it was done, he stood up and went out, hung it on the door to the wig room. "I'm closing up shop," he said, then added with finality, "until further notice." "I guess I'll have to take over then." Daniel glared at me. "Over my dead body," he said. It seemed a particularly ill-chosen cliche, but hell, consider the source, and I know when I'm not welcome. So I left Daniel in his dark and dismal dungeon and went back upstairs to the auditorium. I entered quietly by one of the side doors and was just in time to hear the finale to Act 1. During that music, the singing was so exciting and the ensemble work so tight that I realized that Marcella Ostinata's death, and perhaps even the subsequent absence of the maestro and Bruce David, that morning might be a blessing to the festival after all. The music had just about stopped reverberating in the hall when Jonathan Byers entered from the wings downstage right. He was applauding the singers and he appeared slightly flushed under the work lights. Whether it was from the thrilling finale or from his first round of questioning with Branco, I could only guess. At the same time, from the opposite side of the stage, Daniel Carafolio made an entrance. His eyes were red, and the tears were running freely down his cheeks. He addressed the entire cast and crew with a loud and tremulous voice. "I am announcing my intention to boycott this production, based on Sir Jonathan Byers' arrogant refusal to recognize the loss of one of opera's greatest voices ever. If any of you have any brains or feelings, you will join me in solidarity and leave the premises now." I expected to hear Lieutenant Branco tell Daniel Carafolio, who was really in charge now, who could say leave and who could say stay, but I didn't see him anywhere. Instead, it was Jonathan Byers who addressed Daniel from his position downstage right. "And if you're still here on opening night," he bellowed, "you can lick my arse. But today I've got work to do." Byers then faced the audience and addressed the production table. "Stage manager, would you please remove Humpty Dumpty from the set?" Rhonda Luker scurried up onto the stage and crossed to where Daniel Carafolio was still standing, apparently transfixed by Sir Jonathan's opening night proposal. It's not often that an invitation to a rimming is made public. Rhonda grabbed Daniel's arm to escort him off, but He jerked it away from her and turned to walk off himself stage left. But who should emerge from those wings at that moment but Lieutenant Branco? He confronted Daniel. There was a moment of freeze action when Branco took him off stage left for questioning. Improvisational theater was still alive. Then Jonathan Byers announced for all the cast and crew to hear. Act 3, Scene 1. Please places in 20 minutes. As the singers dispersed for a break, I wandered backstage myself by this time. I was becoming a familiar enough face in the opera house so that people accepted my presence in the auditorium and backstage, even if they weren't quite sure what I was doing there. As I passed by one of the prop tables, I noticed a big knife lying there. Before I had a chance to study it, one of the stagehands grabbed it and took it to Huang Young Cho, who was on stage practicing his role of Renato, the character who murders the tenor in the last moments of the opera. I found Rhonda Luca in her booth, backstage right. She was consulting her cue sheet for the next scene in rehearsal, and she was instructing various people over her wireless headset as to which lights and sets would ultimately be in place during performance. She seemed to enjoy being in charge, as though giving orders to other people was her natural place in the world. Marcella Ostinata's death hadn't affected her much. I went to her, and during a moment between orders, when she paused for breath, I said, "How's your computer running today?" Rhonda glanced up from her cue sheets. "Oh, hi there," she said. "The computer is fine. It's me who's feeling fried today." "Because the sacred cow is dead?" Rhonda gave me a quizzical look. I said, "Isn't that what you called Madama Ostinata?" "Not sacred," replied Rhonda. "Just a cow." She spoke into her transmitter regarding the placement of glass-topped desk on stage. Then she looked back at me and remarked, "One good thing about a dead diva, she can't sing." "That seems to be the general consensus," I said. "All it takes is 2 ears," she replied. I noticed that Rhonda sported a heavy ring of keys hanging from a metal clip on her wide leather belt. Also attached to that clip was a Swiss Army knife. It was larger than the standard issue model, with what looked to be a 5-inch blade folded into the black housing. It hung from her belt like a slender phallus. I'd never seen a knife like it, and I said so. "Picked it up in Europe," she said simply. Then she unclipped it from her belt and handed it to me. It was heavy, and it did have an extra long blade concealed within. Rhonda said, "Open it up, or are you afraid of knives?" "No," I said. She grabbed it from my hand and flipped open the blade. It was long and sharp with a mirror-like finish that glinted harshly even in the dim backstage lights. The blade looked dangerous enough. You could do some nasty carving with it, but it was hardly the implement to slice open someone's throat as deeply as Madame Ostinata's had been. Still, Rhonda Luca was pretty handy with the knife, especially the way she snapped the blade closed with one hand. I'd never try a trick like that. I'd never even want to learn how. Maybe that's the kind of thing that separated gay boys from gay girls. Rhonda had just finished her show and tell with the knife and was heading back out front to the production table when Lieutenant Branco approached us. He'd been as quick with his questioning of Daniel Carafelio as he had with Jonathan Byers. Perhaps Branco was doing his first session fast to get the lay of the land, or perhaps he was using efficient new police methods. "Are you Rhonda Luca?" he said to her. "Call me Ron," she replied. Branco introduced himself and told her he wanted to ask a few questions. "Fire away," she said. Branco said, "Not here." But Rhonda's receiver beeped before he could say anything more. Rhonda told her caller that no, the glass-topped desk hadn't arrived at the Opera House yet, but to make a note where it belonged on stage once it did. Then she turned to Branco and said, "Sorry." "Not at all," said the cop. "By the way, you aren't related to Tony Luca, are you?" "Ooh," she said. "Runs a fish market in the North End." "In case you hadn't noticed, Lieutenant Luca is a very common name." You could almost be a relative, he said. It's the blood, you ought to know. I've seen one whop, you seen 'em all. Rhonda laughed, and I realized that she had lapsed comfortably into tough guy talk with Branco, something I could never quite pull off. For his part, Branco dismissed her remark as if he knew he was in a class by himself, apart from every other Italian who ever walked the earth. He asked Rhonda to go with him for questioning. She agreed easily and called her assistant to take over for her. When Rhonda walked away with Branco, I noticed a pair of old suede work gloves jammed under her belt and back. Rhonda Luca had executed her butch costume to perfection. With no one else available for me to torment at the moment, I went out into the Opera House lobby. The afternoon sun had warmed the broad glass enclosed space and cast long, slender shadows across the carpeted floor. Standing far away in a dark corner designed for smokers and an endangered architectural detail in smoke-free America was Rick Jansen, alias Ricky Thing, Jonathan Byers' very own wonder slut. He was having a smoke. I felt my investigative claws emerge from their protective sheaths, and I headed over to him. As I approached the smoker's nook, I heard and felt a super efficient ventilation system at work, almost like a wind tunnel, but on the suck end instead of the blow. The vacuum tugged at my hair, even though it's cropped fairly close to my skull. Any secondhand smoke in that corner would be taken and sent far, far away from the rest of the Opera House lobby. Ricky blew a lungful of smoke toward me, a certified aggressive gesture, but instead of hitting me in the face, the smoke flew directly from his lips and up past his own face toward the overhead ducts. He said, "Don't you belong downstairs?" "They lit me up for air today," I answered. "Too bad," he said. "I see you've regained your footing with Jonathan Byers." "What's that supposed to mean?" He tried blowing another puff of smoke at me, but with the same ridiculous effect. I said, "It looked like you were playing second fiddle to Adam Pierce until he was killed." "That was an accident." "So say the police, but I wonder." "Look," said Ricky, "why don't you mind your own business and tend to the hairnets? It gets kind of lonely. Besides, I like to watch people, what they say and do, especially when they're provoked. It's my nature, the same way it's your nature to hustle." He took a step toward me. "You don't know my real nature," he said. The cigarette dangled from his lips. It might have looked tough if he wasn't so blond and if the smoke wasn't being sucked upward in a thin, wispy stream. "I can guess," I said, "or is the tough guy just a facade for the puss underneath?" "I'll beat the shit out of you," he said. "Would that give you a hard-on?" He braced himself and swung at me, but his preparations gave me plenty of time to duck. His whole move was too calculated, and I sensed it had been a feint. I also sensed that if Rick had wanted to connect, he would have. I said, "There are other ways to make a point besides violence." He sneered. "Violence works for me." I backed away cautiously, but he followed me. "Are you afraid yet?" he said. "Why do you hate me?" "Because you're a faggot." "And you're not," I said. "I'm a man," he replied. "Explain the difference," I said, still backing away. He was trying to seethe as if to imitate his mentor, Jonathan Byers. "The difference is," he said, "you want to suck my thing, but I'd just as soon beat your face with it." "You sure know how to sweet-talk a guy." He lunged toward me with a jab, and I leaped back, but his fist caught the fabric of my shirt front. The force knocked me off balance, but I stumbled. He jumped onto me, and we fell to the floor. We grappled each other, two sissies of opposing viewpoints engaged in unmanly combat. I aimed to roll us over to get myself on top, where my extra weight would give me an advantage. All that playful wrestling with my lover had taught me how to use leverage to overcome his sheer muscle strength. And that's how I got Ricky pinned down, by yielding to the manic pressure of his arms and torso for a split second, so that in that momentary empty space of his pressing against nothing, I could change the angle of my shoulders slightly and get a new footing with one leg, and then give one good push with that leg and roll Ricky over in exactly the same direction that he was still applying pressure onto me. It's really simple. Cats do it all the time. Where the squirmy ones can always overtake the bruisers. It's all timing and leverage. So I got Ricky pinned to the floor and applied my weight just heavily enough to keep him restrained. I didn't press all of it onto him because I wanted something to maneuver. That's when I told him he should be nicer to the less fortunate faggots who didn't have his pretty looks and nice muscles. We have feelings too. That's exactly when two of the investigative cops finally showed up and broke up the fight, if you could call it that. Just when I was scoring a victory for all the unsung sissy heroes among us. Like two schoolboys after a tussle, we told the cops that neither of us was hurt, which was true, and that the fight was all about nothing, which was false. Ricky headed quickly into the auditorium, retreating in shame. I wanted to think, but I stayed in the lobby for someone else had come out there as well. It was Carolyn Bowitz. She told me she had just entered the lobby for a break when she noticed the trouble between me and Rick, so she alerted the police. I thanked her and then complimented her on what I'd heard of the rehearsal. She peered at me through her thick eyeglasses. Her myopic eyes seemed keener and more daring than before. She said, "The maestro isn't coming in today, so I'm in charge, or at least musically. It's obvious that you're qualified." "It's all I've ever wanted to do," she said blissfully. I said, "It's too bad about Madama Ostinata." "Yes," said Carolyn suddenly without emotion. "Too bad, but we'll manage. The show will go on as scheduled. And for what I heard today, it may sound even better." Carolyn's eyes flickered nervously. "I have no doubt about that. Do you hear the new tenor?" "Yes." "Then you know that he's much better than Bruce David." "It's obvious," I said. "And it doesn't take a psychoanalyst to see that Bruce David doesn't have what it takes for an operatic career." I thought that was a cheap shot at Daphne. Carolyn continued, "He can barely get through one area without problems, never mind a role like Ricardo." "And the other tenor can." "I'm sure of it," she said. "He and I rehearsed all night." "Where?" She looked at me suspiciously. "In one of the rehearsal studios here at the Performance Center." "Was anyone else there with you?" "No, but neither of us went out again. You can check the security report. It will show that we never left the Performance Center last night. We all have electronic keys, and they automatically record who goes in and out of where and when." "I didn't ask you for an alibi," I said. Carolyn blushed. "I'm sorry. I guess I'm a little nervous with the police around." "And a little defensive," I added. But I was intrigued that she knew or even cared about the high-tech security system around the Performance Center. I asked her why she'd spent so much time with the second tenor the previous night. Had she known that Bruce would not sing? She answered, "I was preparing for the inevitable." "Was Marcella Ostinata's death inevitable?" "That," said Carolyn, "was a blessing." Then she quickly added, "I know this sounds cold. I'm truly sorry about what happened to her, but Marcella caused much more trouble than she was worth. We were all running around trying to sustain a glamorous legend instead of collaborating with a great artist. The fact is, I wonder if she ever could sing." Carolyn made a small grimace. Perhaps her vocal gifts came too light during performance. "We'll never know that now," I said. She looked at her watch. "It's time for me to go back in." "You haven't had a very restful break." "I'm fine," she said blithely. "You probably wouldn't guess, but I like excitement. It refreshes me," and she returned to the auditorium to make beautiful music again. At that point, I'd done all the investigating I could at the Opera House except for Jonathan Byers, Wong Young Cho, and April Kilkis, who were all rehearsing again. I'd either offended or vanquished anyone else who could possibly be considered a suspect in Marcella Ostinata's murder, and I wasn't quite ready to return to Daphne's house, so with time on my hands, I telephoned Nicole, who I knew would be at Snip's salon in Boston. When the receptionist answered the phone, I could hear the comforting, homey sounds of a busy salon in the background. I almost felt the familiar sting of perm solution in my nostrils. I asked the receptionist to send Nicole to the phone in my office at the back of the shop. I wanted her to have privacy for this little chat. She eventually came on the line in her usual brusque manner. "Stanley," she said, "is everything all right?" "Yeah, doll." My throat choked up at the sound of her voice. I didn't realize how much I was missing my best friend. "We're extremely busy here today, darling, so there really isn't time." "Nikki, the Diva was murdered this morning." "No!" It was awful. The local police couldn't handle it, so they called in the boys from Boston. Lieutenant Branco is out here now." "Ah," said Nicole. "How is Vito?" "I just found out that his parents died recently." The line went quiet while I heard her light up a cigarette. That's unusual for her to smoke on the telephone. Nicole is one of those rare creatures who smokes in ritualistic pleasure, not mindless habit. She is always seated and she smokes actively. For Nicole, a cigarette is a focus, not a secondary prop. That she was lighting up now meant her emotions were charged. "When did it happen?" she said. "A few months ago." "That explains the long hiatus." Branco says he purposely kept to himself, didn't tell anybody, but apparently the retreat didn't help much. "The odd thing is, Nicky, he seems friendlier now." Nicole puffed quietly. "Doll," I said. After a brief pause, she spoke. "I think Vito probably is better off when he's by himself." "How can you say that when you dated him, Nicky?" "That's exactly why I know, darling." She puffed some more, and somehow I knew not to talk, and when she spoke again, she finally answered an old question that had plagued me during all the time she spent with Branco. "I assume by now," she said, "that you realize Vito and I never had sex." "I could only guess, doll. You kept the fog pretty thick." "It was always platonic between us." "Not for lack of you trying through, though." "You're wrong there, Stanley. I took all my cues from him." "Everyone does." There's no other way with a man like that, but I sensed from the beginning that Vito Branco is the kind of man who has difficulty getting close to people, especially to women. Another pause. More puffy. He confessed to me once that whenever the loneliness becomes unbearable, he would pay for sex. He thought it was healthier than being alone. "Wow," went my silent voice. Nicole went on. "He stopped it when he realized he was beginning to enjoy getting rough with the women." "Nicky, enough." As though weakened from a trance, Nicole changed her tone of voice and said, "Stanley, you realize what I'm telling you is in utmost confidence. You must never let Vito know what I've just said." "Don't worry, doll." "I do worry. I've just broken a promise to him. I've said too much, and you're not very good at keeping secrets." "Mea culpa." "But Stanley, this time you must." "I will, doll. I will. I do have some control over my mouth." Nicole tried to stifle a laugh. Meanwhile, I was already setting up differential equations that might explain the true nature of Lieutenant Branco's sexuality. "He never hit you, did he, Nicky? I recall that time when your arm was bruised." "Vito never approached me physically," said Nicole. "Except for a chaste kiss on the cheek, he was always the perfect gentleman." She sighed heavily into the receiver. "Please give him my condolences." "I will, Nicky." There was a long pause, and we both seemed to realize that unless we had about 6 hours and a liter of cognac, there was nothing more to say about Lieutenant Vito Branco at the moment. "How's Ramon doing?" I said. Ramon was a former shampoo boy at Snips who was handling some of my clients in my absence. "He's coming along quite nicely," replied Nicole. "Not as good as you, darling, but who could be?" "Thanks, Nicky. You know I mean it." "Kind of." "When are you coming home?" "I'm not sure, doll. The investigation's just started." "But isn't the opera closing down?" "No." "So you're staying out there?" "For a while. Maybe I can help. Like I said, Branco seems friendlier now." "Stanley, please don't call him Branco." "But that's who he is, Nicky. He's Vito to you, but he's Branco to me." Nicole said, "Maybe someday he'll be Vito to you, too." "When cows fly and horses sing, doll." There was That talking horse on television, she said. I'll call you with updates, I said. You call me every day, Stanley. Yes, ma'am, I said, though I knew I wouldn't. And remember to give my regards to Vito. Just regards. That will do, she said. For now. CIAO, doll. There was a moment's silence when I expected the line to go dead. Since Nicole never says goodbye, but instead I heard her say quietly, Take care, Stanley. I'll try, Nikki. Then came the familiar click. A Gay Mysteries audiobooks. I think it is easy to hate a label, but a face humanizes the word. So this effort is twofold. To offer comfort to those like myself that your world didn't end because you don't fit into the view of acceptable society on both sides. And in hopes of helping those with family that are LGBTQ, that it doesn't mean we are aliens from the child they once knew. Reassure them so they can maybe be supportive at the same time, being true to their values.